The year was 1838, and deep in the red soil of Georgia stood a house that seemed to hold its breath. It was not merely a plantation, not merely a house of cotton and coin. It was a stage, and on its wooden boards every scream and silence had meaning. From a distance it looked like the perfect image of southern wealth. Tall white columns reaching toward a pitiless sky, fields stretching endlessly, cotton swaying like a pale sea under the sun. But up close the truth became clearer. Every plank of wood, every brick in its chimneys, every acre of tilled soil was mortared with human suffering. The master of this place was a man of stature, one who walked as though even the earth beneath his boots had been purchased. He carried himself with the certainty of ownership, of dominion, as though every breath of air that crossed the land belonged first to him before it entered the lungs of others. His name was spoken carefully by the enslaved, never too loud, never with anything less than trembling respect. Beside him, always beside him, yet always apart, stood his wife, a woman of porcelain skin and hollow eyes, wrapped in fine dresses imported from across the sea, yet burdened by a weight no fabric could conceal. She had been married into privilege, promised a legacy, promised the life of a matriarch who would oversee generations. But beneath her corset beat the cruelest truth of her existence. Her womb was barren. No child had ever quickened in her belly, no cry of new life had echoed in her chambers. Her sterility was a wound deeper than flesh, and her husband ensured that wound was never allowed to close. And then there were the enslaved women, figures of shadow in the master's world, yet central to his designs. They worked the fields, cooked the meals, raised the children of others while their own were sold or stolen away. Their lives belonged not to themselves but to the whims of the man who owned their bodies. In their silence, in their lowered eyes, in the scars across their backs, was a truth too horrific for polite society to name aloud. The house itself seemed to know. Its walls absorbed the echoes of weeping. Its floorboards groaned beneath footsteps heavy with guilt. At night, the shutters clattered against the wind as if protesting what unfolded behind them. To those who passed along the dirt roads of Georgia, it looked like nothing more than another seat of southern gentility. But those who lived within its shadow knew otherwise. They knew it was a place of breeding. The master did not believe his wife's barrenness should deny him heirs. His bloodline, he declared, was too precious, too pure, too vital to end with him. And so, with a coldness that was as calculated as it was cruel, he turned to the women he already owned. The plantation became not just a farm of cotton, but a farm of flesh. The sterile wife would be made to witness what she could never give. She would sit in silence while her husband claimed enslaved women as tools for legacy, her presence a punishment, her gaze a mirror of shame. Yet this horror was not to be unveiled at once. It began in whispers, in the way the wife avoided the nursery wings of neighboring homes, in the way her husband's hand lingered on the shoulders of the young women who served wine at dinner, in the way nights fell heavier than days, as though the darkness itself was thick with unspoken truths. The enslaved women knew what was coming before it began. They read it in the cold glint of the master's eye, in the tense, brittle silence of his wife. They had seen other plantations where such practices were whispered of, but never spoken in the open. Now it would be their turn to endure it. And the wife, barren, embittered, bound by duty, would be dragged into the spectacle, forced to watch life created where she could never give it. The stage was set. Georgia in 1838 was a land rich with soil and blood, and on this land the master's will would unfold. The columns of the house would stand tall against the horizon, whitewashed and gleaming, hiding behind their shine the rot that crept through every corner of its halls. History would not remember this place by name. The records would disguise its secrets, and the descendants of its people would never find it marked on a map. But the earth remembers. The ground still carries the weight of the screams buried within it. The unmarked graves of children born only to be chained. The tears of a wife who watched and never forgave, and so begins the story, not of wealth, not of cotton, but of cruelty carved into the heart of Georgia. A story of a master, a barren wife, and the women who bore the weight of both. Sterility was not simply a medical condition in 1838, It was a curse, a whisper that spread faster than fire in the southern air. For a woman of standing, barrenness was not a private sorrow, but a public shame, paraded in silence across every gathering, every supper table, every church pew. And for the wife of a slave master, the absence of a child was not just a wound upon her heart. It was a stain upon his name. The doctors came, one after another, each bearing the cold certainty of men who thought themselves custodians of divine order. They examined her, questioned her, offered remedies brewed in bottles, and whispered advice laced with pity. She drank bitter tonics, bathed in herbs, endured leeching and bleeding, prayed until her lips cracked and her knees bruised upon wooden floors. But no life quickened in her womb. Month after month, year after year, her chambers remained silent, and with each passing season, her husband's eyes grew harder. He did not strike her, he did not need to. His silence was sharper than any whip, his disdain more scarring than any lash. At dinners, his hand would linger too long on the goblet, his gaze fixed not on his wife, but on the young women who served. In public he smiled politely, but in private his words became daggers. "A house without an heir is no house at all," the community whispered. Plantation wives would glance at her with pity, their eyes darting away quickly lest she read their thoughts. Mothers would clutch their children closer when she passed, as though her barrenness might spread like a contagion. Even the enslaved, though forced into silence, felt the tension that wrapped itself around her presence. A mistress without children was not truly a mistress. She was a ghost, haunting the halls of her own home. And yet, she had once dreamed of legacy. When she first married, she had embroidered tiny clothes, prepared names whispered in candlelight, pressed her hands against her belly with hope. Each disappointment hollowed her further, until those dreams became dust in a locked drawer, tucked away where no one could see. Her husband, however, did not bury his ambitions. His obsession with bloodline only sharpened with time. He spoke of legacy as though it were scripture. He prided himself on land, wealth, and status, but without children, without heirs, what was it worth? He told her this often, his voice steady, his words deliberate. Wealth dies with the man. Blood lives forever. It was not just disappointment, it was fury, the fury of a man who believed himself wronged by fate, and his fury needed an outlet. The wife became that outlet. She was paraded as a failure in her own home, her sterility an open wound that he pressed salt into day after day. At night she would hear him pacing. His boots against the floorboards echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Sometimes she would hear the door open and close in the hours before dawn, his figure disappearing into the fields or toward the slave quarters. She knew where he went, though she dared not voice it aloud. To accuse him would be to admit her powerlessness. To name it would be to make it real. Her prayers grew darker. She no longer begged for children. She begged for silence. She begged for her husband's obsession to fade, for the whispers to cease, for the crushing weight of expectation to be lifted from her chest. But prayers offered no reprieve, only the tightening of the chains that bound her to a role she could never fulfill. The enslaved women, too, began to sense the shift. They saw the hunger in the master's eyes, the way he appraised them not as workers, but as vessels. They saw the bitterness in the mistress's face, the quiet rage she swallowed each time she was forced to serve tea with a smile while her womb betrayed her. They knew that storms were gathering within those walls, and when storms gather, they do not wait long before they break. One evening, beneath the flickering glow of candlelight, her husband spoke words that made her blood run cold. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, but it was the gentleness of a predator, the softness of a blade just before it cuts. "If you cannot give me heirs," he said, "others will. And you will see them born with your own eyes, so you might understand what you have denied me." The words carved into her like scripture, unerasable, undeniable. She tried to respond, to plead, to argue, but no sound escaped her lips. She sat frozen, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between them, the shadows on the walls dancing like ghosts of children who would never come. From that moment, she was no longer simply barren. She was a spectator in her own undoing. The curse of sterility was no longer hers alone. It had been transformed into a weapon wielded against her. What had once been private sorrow became public humiliation. She would not just be reminded of her failure, she would be made to watch as it was corrected before her eyes. By women who had no choice, by bodies that were not free. The seed of obsession had been planted in the master's mind, and like the cotton in his fields, it would grow, choke, and consume until there was no soil left unstained. Obsession is a slow poison. It seeps into the veins, lodges itself in the marrow, and begins to rewrite a man's very being until nothing remains but the hunger that drives him. For the master of the Georgia plantation, sterility was not simply his wife's curse, it was an affront to him, a humiliation that mocked his legacy. And humiliation, to a man who had built his world on dominion, was unbearable. At first it was unspoken. He prowled the halls with eyes that no longer lingered on his wife, eyes that slipped past her as though she were furniture, as though she were merely another lifeless part of the house. His gaze drifted instead toward the enslaved women who moved through the rooms, silent shadows carrying trays, drawing curtains, tending to the smallest of chores. What began as glances soon became choices. He began assigning them tasks within the house, deliberately keeping them within arm's reach. The wife noticed. She saw how her husband's hand brushed too near when he handed over a goblet, how his words carried a tone that was not command, but possession. She saw the flickers of terror in the women's eyes, the way they lowered their heads even further when his shadow fell upon them. And then, one night he made his decree. It was after supper, the fire crackling low in the hearth, shadows stretching long across the walls. The wife sat with her embroidery untouched in her lap, her hands motionless, her heart already heavy with dread. The master rose from his chair with the calm of a man who believed every word he spoke was law. "This house will have heirs," he said. His voice carried no hesitation, no trace of debate. "If not by you, then by others. I will not see my blood end. You will not only know it, you will witness it. You will sit, and you will see what must be done." The words hung in the air like smoke. The wife's lips parted, but no reply came. She had no power to refuse. Her silence was his victory. The first time was the cruelest. She was led to a chair near the hearth, her body rigid, her face pale as parchment. The enslaved woman brought before them was young, scarcely more than a girl, trembling so violently her knees threatened to give beneath her. She was not brought by choice, there was no choice to be had. She was property, ordered as one might order a horse to the stable. The wife's eyes burned with humiliation as she realized her role. She was not simply to be replaced, she was to be made audience. Her barrenness was to be underlined by every gasp, every cry, every moment of life forced where hers could not exist. The master relished it. To him, this was not cruelty, it was justice, a correction of nature's error. His legacy would continue, and his sterile wife would bear witness to her own irrelevance. He believed himself righteous, a man securing his bloodline in the only way God had left him. He cloaked depravity in the language of destiny. For the enslaved woman, it was horror beyond words. For the wife, it was torture beyond measure. For the master, it was triumph, and as one night became two and two became many, the ritual was born. Each time the wife was summoned. Each time a different enslaved woman was chosen. And each time, the master's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had bent the world to his will. The wife's presence was essential. It was not enough for her to know. She had to see. At first she wept. Silent tears, clenched fists, a body trembling with rage she dared not voice. But over time the tears dried. Her eyes grew hollow, her face a mask. She learned to sit motionless, a porcelain doll cracked but unbroken, her silence both shield and shackle. Yet beneath that silence, her soul screamed. For the women forced into this ritual, there was no escape. Their bodies bore the weight of his obsession, their futures rewritten without consent. They endured it in silence, for silence was their only weapon. To cry too loud was to risk punishment. To resist was to invite violence. And so they bore it with lowered eyes and broken hearts. their suffering witnessed not just by their master, but by the mistress who could do nothing to stop it. The house changed. Its air grew heavier, its walls darker as though it too absorbed the sickness within. Servants moved like shadows, speaking less, glancing nervously toward doors that might open at any hour of night. The plantation's wealth continued to grow, but its soul rotted, poisoned by the master's obsession. The wife's world collapsed inward. She began to fear mirrors, for in them she saw the hollow woman she had become. She began to fear sleep, for in her dreams she saw herself replaced by the faces of the enslaved women, their wombs full while hers remained barren. Her life became an endless echo of absence. Absence of children, absence of choice, absence of dignity. But obsession is never satisfied. With every act, the master grew bolder, more certain of his righteousness. He began to speak openly of the children that would soon come, children of his blood who would carry his name, even if they carried chains as well. He imagined them strong, numerous, evidence of his control carved into flesh. For him, the plantation was no longer only a field of cotton. It was a field of heirs. The wife knew then that her torment had no end. She would grow old in that chair, watching, always watching, as her husband sowed the seeds of legacy in the bodies of women who had no voice. Her life had become an endless theater of humiliation, her barrenness transformed into a spectacle. And in that silence, in that unbearable role, something inside her began to crack. Not yet a scream, not yet a plan, but a fracture, a fault line deep within her soul. One day it would break open. One day the silence would end. But for now, she endured. She sat in the chair like a statue carved from bone, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the fire that crackled in the hearth. Night after night, the ritual unfolded around her, and night after night she remained still, silent, unblinking, her body present, but her soul adrift. She was the wife, the mistress of the house, the woman meant to command respect. Yet here, in these hours, she was nothing more than an unwilling spectator, a prisoner in her own parlor. At first, she had fought her silence. The cries of the enslaved women, the sickening rhythm of her husband's obsession, the humiliation that gnawed at her. She had wanted to scream, to rise from her chair and tear the house down around them. But what was rebellion against a man who held every key? She had tried once, her voice breaking as she begged him to stop. His response had been swift, his gaze colder than winter steel. "You will sit. You will see. That is your place." And so she learned. She swallowed her rage. She buried her voice. She became the silent witness to her own undoing. Her hatred spread like a contagion. It festered first against her husband, the man who had reduced her from wife to ornament, from partner to punishment. She hated his pride, his calm certainty, the way he dressed cruelty in the clothing of destiny. But her hatred did not stop with him. It turned inward, poisoning her thoughts against herself. If I were a true woman, a fertile woman, none of this would be happening. The lie wrapped itself around her like a noose, pulled tighter each time she sat in that chair, and then, more dangerously, her hatred flickered toward the enslaved women. They were victims, as powerless as she, yet in their forced fertility, she saw a cruel mirror of her own failure. When their bellies swelled, she felt her emptiness more keenly. When their children cried, she heard the silence of her own womb mocking her. She despised them not for what they chose, but for what they could not help. Her bitterness was a serpent coiled inside her chest, hissing against all it touched, each night blurred into the next. She sat through it all, the trembling of women dragged forward, the master's cold satisfaction, the air thick with shame and despair. The firelight threw shadows against the walls, shadows that seemed to move like specters. Ghost children born of her absence, dancing in the periphery of her sight. She began to believe the house itself watched her, mocking her with its groaning floorboards and sighing shutters. Her body began to wither under the strain. She grew pale, her hands trembling, her eyes ringed with dark hollows. Servants whispered of her decline, but no one dared to intervene. Her meals went untouched, Her days passed in silence, her nights in forced witness. She became less a woman than a ghost haunting her own halls, yet even in her silence, she remembered. Every face of every enslaved woman forced before her, every moment of her humiliation, every word her husband spoke. It etched itself into her memory. She carried it all, an ever-growing burden pressed into her mind. The weight of it bent her but did not break her. Not yet. Sometimes in the darkest hours she imagined revenge. She imagined rising from her chair, seizing the poker from the hearth, driving it into her husband's chest while the firelight painted him in hell's glow. She imagined freeing the women, burning the house to ash, vanishing into the night. These fantasies were her only sustenance. She clung to them, fed on them, even as she knew they were impossible, for now. And still she endured. Endured because endurance was all she had. The enslaved women avoided her gaze when they could. They did not wish to see their suffering reflected in her eyes, and she did not wish to see her emptiness reflected in theirs. Yet sometimes by accident their eyes met, and in that brief connection a terrible truth passed between them. Both were prisoners. Both were broken. Both carried burdens not of their making, but the wife's burden was different. She was not only a victim, she was a witness, and to witness such cruelty in silence is to become complicit in it. That knowledge burned in her. It hollowed her further, carving out the last fragments of the woman she had once been. The plantation thrived around them, cotton growing tall and plentiful, wealth flowing into the master's hands. To the outside world it was a house of prosperity, but inside, within its walls, it was a theater of torment. Its mistress the unwilling audience. Night after night, year after year, and though her lips never moved, though her hands never rose, the silence was not endless. Silence is a mask, and masks crack. Somewhere beneath her stillness something was shifting, something dangerous, something that would one day erupt, for now she was the silent witness. But silence, like obsession, cannot last forever. They were not names in the ledger. They were not faces in the crowd. They were flesh, blood, and sorrow, though the master spoke of them as if they were cattle, measured in numbers, valued by strength, catalogued by wombs. To him they were vessels. To the mistress they were reminders. To themselves they were women, women robbed of choice, stripped of freedom and yet still clinging somehow to fragments of humanity that no chain could fully erase. By day, they worked in the fields, their hands raw from pulling cotton, their backs bent beneath the southern sun. The overseer's whip cracked like thunder, a reminder that pain was never more than a breath away. They endured it, as they endured everything else, their bodies moving in rhythm with labor while their minds wandered elsewhere. To the songs of their mothers, to the rivers of their youth, to children torn from their arms and sold across counties. But by night, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the world quieted, another torment awaited them. The ritual was never spoken of, yet all knew its weight. The master would summon one of them, sometimes with words, more often with a gesture. Resistance was impossible. Their steps toward the parlor were heavy, each footfall echoing like the toll of a bell. Behind them, the others watched in silence, each secretly praying it would not be their turn. Inside the parlor, the wife sat stiff in her chair, eyes fixed on the fire, face drained of all warmth. She was a prisoner too, yet in their eyes she was also the jailer's accomplice, for she never stopped the cruelty, never turned away, never shielded them. The enslaved women despised her silence as much as they despised his violence. When it was over, they returned to their quarters, carrying the weight of what had been done to them. Sometimes they cried softly into their hands. Sometimes they held one another, seeking comfort in the only place it could be found. And sometimes they said nothing at all, letting the silence spread, because words were too fragile to hold their pain. Months later, the evidence of their violation would swell beneath their dresses. Their bellies, once flat and taut from hunger, now grew heavy with life. Some prayed for stillbirths, knowing that death might be kinder than a life in bondage. Others prayed their children might be spared the whip, though they knew the truth. Every new child was another coin in the master's pocket, another chain securing the future of the plantation. There was no joy in those pregnancies, no laughter, no gatherings of women around the expectant mother, no whispered hopes of what the child might become. Instead, there was fear. Fear of birthing in the cramped, dirty quarters. Fear of their bodies breaking under the strain. Fear of what it meant to bring another soul into the world, only to see it enslaved from its first breath. Yet even in despair, some nurtured flickers of love. They sang lullabies at night, voices hushed and trembling, songs carried across oceans from ancestors they barely remembered. They carved tiny toys from scraps of wood, braided their children's hair with tenderness, whispered words of freedom into ears too small to understand. In those small rebellions of love, they defied the master's intent. He wanted property. They gave birth to sons and daughters. He wanted silence. They gave their children stories. He wanted control. They gave each other hope, but hope was dangerous. The overseer crushed it when he could, breaking families apart, selling children as soon as they could walk. A woman who birthed too many times might be hollowed by grief, her arms forever empty. Some tried to flee, desperate to escape the cycle. But the woods were vast, the dogs swift, the punishment unbearable. Still, whispers spread among them, whispers of poison mixed into meals, of herbs that could end a pregnancy before it took root, of fires that might consume the master's wealth in a single night. Most were too afraid to act, but the whispers lingered, threading through the quarters like smoke. They knew the wife hated them, though not for what they had done. She saw them as reminders of her own barrenness, as rivals in a contest none of them had chosen. But the enslaved women saw her too. They saw the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. They saw the emptiness in her eyes, the misery she carried like a second skin. In rare, fleeting moments, pity stirred among them. She too is trapped, they thought. But her chains are gilded, and she holds the key to ours, though she does not use it. Some of the younger women whispered about rebellion, about what might happen if the wife chose to rise instead of watch. Would she help us? Would she strike him down? Would she set us free? But the older women silenced them quickly. Hope, they knew, was a double-edged blade. To believe too much was to invite deeper suffering. The nights went on. The master's obsession grew, and with it the weight on their bodies, their souls. They were forced to breed, not for family, not for love, but for commerce. Each child born was a line in the ledger, a future harvest secured, a body that would one day pick the cotton that stained their hands red. Yet even in the shadow of this horror, they endured. They endured because they had no choice. They endured because endurance was, in itself, a weapon, one that kept alive the possibility that one day, somehow the world might change, and so the enslaved women lived, day after day, night after night, their lives bound to the will of a man who saw them only as wombs, and a wife who saw them only as mirrors. They were the unseen foundation of the plantation, the silent chorus in its grand performance of cruelty. But silence does not last forever. And among them, in the quiet of the quarters, the seeds of something dangerous were beginning to grow. The plantation was not simply land and labor. It was an empire of suffering, engineered with the cold precision of profit. Every lash of the whip, every tear shed in the slave quarters, every forced breeding ritual in the parlor. These were not accidents of cruelty, but investments. The master believed he was not just a man of property, but a craftsman of wealth, shaping the future of his bloodline in the South with the bodies of those he owned. Cotton was king in Georgia, and the king demanded tribute. Fields stretched endlessly, white blossoms rising like ghosts from the earth. The master walked those fields with pride, not because of their beauty, but because he saw them as a sea of dollars. Each acre was an account ledger. Each enslaved body was a column of profit and loss. A man in 1838 did not need to breed more children to secure wealth, but the master knew what others whispered: slaves were capital. They were worth more than land, more than livestock. A single child born into bondage was an asset, an heirloom passed not through love, but through chains. The enslaved women's wombs were his bank, their pregnancies a harvest he did not need to plant. To Southern society, this was not perverse. It was practical. Neighbors might whisper about his wife's barrenness, but they did not condemn his methods. Quietly, some envied him. They too wished for natural increase in their holdings, for children born into captivity meant fewer coins spent at the auction block. What the master enacted in the shadows of his plantation parlor was, to them, simply another form of accounting. The wife knew this truth, though it corroded her soul. She was humiliated not only because she could not give him a child, but because her failure had turned her womb into an economic liability. Her barrenness was not just personal, it was financial. Her shame was measured not only in whispers at church, but in the unspoken arithmetic of Southern inheritance. And so she sat in silence, forced to watch him take what she could not provide. Each violation of the enslaved women was a transaction, and she was the witness. Her tears were not counted, but the children born of those nights were. They were assets, numbered like mules, calculated into the master's estate, destined to carry the cotton trade into the next generation. The brutality of the system was not hidden, it was written in contracts, in deeds, in the very laws of Georgia. A child born to an enslaved woman inherited the mother's bondage, no matter who the father was. This legal truth was the master's justification. To him there was no crime in what he did, only profit. His heirs, denied to him by his barren wife, could be multiplied by enslaved wombs without consequence. The law was his shield. The economy was his weapon. The enslaved women understood this, even if no one said it aloud. They knew their bodies were currency. Their pregnancies were celebrated by no one but the master, who saw in their swelling bellies not children, but dividends. They whispered to one another that every cry of a newborn was the sound of chains tightening. Some prayed for miscarriages, others for herbs to steal life away before it could be claimed. For them, to resist the economics of cruelty was to resist life itself. The master, however, celebrated each birth as if it were proof of his genius. He paraded the children before guests, disguising their origins behind a mask of paternal benevolence. A growing house, he would say, as though his cruelty were merely ambition. He spoke of them as evidence of divine favor, a blessing upon his plantation. Behind the smiles, his neighbors nodded in approval. They did not question his methods, for their own wealth was secured by the same blood-stained system. Even the markets reflected his calculations. A young enslaved man could be worth hundreds of dollars. A young enslaved woman more still, for she carried the potential of children within her. Their value was not in their humanity, but in their ability to reproduce labor. The mistress knew this. She had seen the auction blocks, seen girls barely 12 years old sold, not for their arms or their backs, but for their wombs. She carried that knowledge like a stone in her chest, heavy and unyielding. At night, when the master counted his coins, he did not think of the screams that earned them. He thought of expansion. More land, more fields, more laborers born into his control. He imagined a dynasty carved from cotton, one that would stretch long after he was gone. His cruelty was not passion, it was arithmetic, but cruelty built on numbers leaves cracks in the soul. The enslaved women, though broken in body, clung to their humanity in ways that could not be measured. Their lullabies, their whispered prayers, their defiant glances, these were not recorded in ledgers. Yet they carried a power the master did not understand, for while he saw them as investments, they saw themselves as survivors. And survival, in the face of such cruelty, was its own rebellion. Every child they loved, every story they passed down, every trace of dignity they preserved, it was resistance, subtle and enduring. The mistress, watching from her gilded chair, began to sense it too. Though she loathed them, though she resented their swollen bellies, she could not ignore the strength in their suffering. Their endurance made her feel smaller, weaker, hollowed by comparison. They bore pain she could not imagine, yet they did not shatter. She, with all her wealth and finery, was the one unraveling. The plantation was a kingdom built on cruelty, but cruelty is a poor foundation. Beneath the numbers, beneath the arithmetic of wealth, cracks were spreading. In the shadows of the quarters, whispers grew louder. The enslaved women began to murmur not only of herbs and miscarriages, but of fire, of poison, of knives hidden in the dark. The master believed he had perfected his system, that the economics of cruelty would secure his legacy. But every empire of suffering carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. And on this plantation, in Georgia's red soil, those seeds had already begun to grow. They came into the world crying, their voices sharp against the heavy silence of the quarters. Infants born of violence, carried into life by women who had no choice, claimed instantly by a man who called them his wealth. These children were unlike others. They bore his features, his eyes, his cheekbones, the unmistakable stamp of his bloodline, but they were not heirs. They were assets. From their first breath, they belonged not to their mothers, not even to themselves, but to the ledger. The master counted them as he counted bales of cotton, each one a guarantee of future profit. To him, they were the solution to every insecurity. His wife's barrenness, whispers of his cursed line, the doubts of his neighbors. He saw in their tiny faces not innocence but validation. Yet for the mothers, each child was both a blessing and a wound. They loved them fiercely, as only the enslaved could love children born into chains. They cradled them with trembling hands, sang lullabies against the walls of the quarters, whispered prayers that one day, somehow, they might know freedom. But love was dangerous, for with love came fear. At any moment the child could be taken, sold, stripped away. Every smile, every laugh, every step was shadowed by the threat of loss. The mistress, meanwhile, could not bear to look at them. They haunted her. Every child's face was a reflection of what she could not give. They carried the master's blood, but it was the enslaved women who bore them. To her, the children were insults wrapped in flesh. When she passed them in the yard, she turned her head sharply away, as if the sight might burn her. Yet sometimes, when no one was watching, her eyes lingered. She studied them in silence, tracing the curve of their faces, the resemblance to her husband. In those moments, jealousy tangled with grief, leaving her hollow. The children themselves grew in a strange limbo. Too light for the quarters, too dark for the house. They were set apart, marked by features that made their parentage undeniable. Other planters whispered about them, some mocking, some envious. The master did not hide them. On the contrary, he flaunted them. "My stock is strong," he boasted, patting the head of a boy who bore his same crooked smile. He spoke as if breeding were not cruelty, but achievement, as if his own children were trophies of conquest. But for the wife, each boast was a blade. She smiled when required, nodded in silence, all the while feeling her insides rot. In the quiet of her chambers she replayed the scenes of her humiliation, her husband's hands on others, her forced role as a witness. The children were living reminders, their laughter a mockery, their cries a wound she could not close. And yet, in the twisted corners of her mind, a bond sometimes flickered. There were nights when she stood at her window, watching a girl with braids chase fireflies near the quarters. The child's laugh rang high, piercing the still air. In that fleeting sound, the mistress felt something that was almost maternal, almost love. But the feeling curdled quickly, replaced by rage. She shut the shutters violently, as though cutting off the sight could sever the emotion. The children themselves bore the weight of contradiction. They were raised knowing their father's identity, yet forbidden to call him so. They were his blood, but they were denied his name. In the eyes of the law, they were nothing more than slaves, destined for the fields, the whip, the auction block. The cruel arithmetic of the plantation did not soften for them. It was harsher. They were constant proof of his dominion, living, breathing symbols that his power extended not only over land, but over bodies, over futures. Among the enslaved, the children were both cherished and pitied. Mothers shielded them fiercely, teaching them songs of resistance, warning them to keep their heads low to survive. Older women whispered over them, placing charms around their necks, hoping to guard them from the master's cruelty. They knew too well the fate of children born in bondage. Some would grow strong and be sold away. Others would be broken early, their backs bent before they knew freedom. Still, in the soft hours of night, the quarters filled with the sound of children's laughter. Against all odds they played. They ran barefoot through the dirt, made toys of twigs and stones, chased each other with wild delight. Their innocence was a rebellion, a spark of life the master could not stamp out. To their mothers, each laugh was precious, a reminder that even in chains, joy could still exist. But the mistress heard those sounds too. And where the mothers felt hope, she felt fury. The children were growing, his children, not hers. They filled the plantation with their presence, a chorus of voices she could not silence. Each year, as their numbers grew, her sense of failure deepened. She was a wife without children, yet surrounded by her husband's progeny. It was a prison with no walls, a torment without end. The plantation thrived. Cotton yields rose. Wealth flowed, and with every passing year, the master's empire grew stronger. Built on the backs of children he had sired in cruelty. He saw no shame in it, only pride. But in the shadows of that pride, resentment coiled like a serpent. The wife's hatred sharpened, the enslaved mother's despair deepened, and the children themselves began to sense the fracture at the heart of the place they called home. The children of the plantation were not merely bystanders. They were the future, twisted and bound by the sins of the present. They were proof of the master's power, proof of the wife's humiliation, proof of the enslaved women's suffering. And in their very existence, they carried the seeds of conflict that would one day erupt. For innocence cannot survive long in a house built on cruelty. The plantation did not exist in isolation. Its wealth bought influence, its cotton-fed markets, and its master's pride demanded recognition. But even in a society built on slavery, there were lines that, when crossed, stirred unease. And soon, the master's household became the subject of whispers drifting through Georgia's parlors, churches, and taverns. It began quietly, with sidelong glances. Guests at suppers noticed too many children running about the yard, children with eyes too pale, skin too light, features too sharp to belong wholly to the quarters. They saw the resemblance, and though they did not speak it aloud, the truth lay heavy in their silence. Some smiled knowingly, their lips curling in cruel amusement. Others looked away, unwilling to confront what they suspected. At church, the wife felt the weight of it most acutely. Women who once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze. Conversations faltered when she entered the room. She heard the low murmurs, half muffled by hymns, questioning her barrenness, mocking her station. To them, she was not simply a woman without children. She was a woman supplanted, her husband's legacy written not through her, but through the wombs of the enslaved. Her face burned under their stares, but she could not flee. The church pew became her scaffold, every service a public execution of her dignity. The whispers traveled further, carried by merchants who visited the plantation, by neighbors who traded gossip over fences, by overseers who drank too much and let slip truths best left unspoken. In the towns of Georgia, the master's name became entwined not only with wealth, but with scandal. Some called him ambitious, a man who knew how to multiply his holdings without the expense of auctions. Others called him depraved, a tyrant who had turned his wife into a witness of his sins. The master himself welcomed the whispers. In his mind they confirmed his dominance. Men envied him, women despised him. What greater proof of power could there be? He carried himself with an air of triumph, unbothered by shame. "Let them talk," he would say, swirling his brandy, lips curled in a smirk. "They talk because they cannot do as I have done." He wore his cruelty like armor, turning gossip into fuel for his pride, but the wife could not share in his arrogance. Each whisper was a blade slicing deeper into her soul. She felt them even when she could not hear them. A glance, a raised brow, a sudden silence when she entered a room. All of it reminded her that she was the object of ridicule. At night, she lay awake, staring into the darkness, her ears ringing with phantom voices. Barren. Useless. Replaced. The enslaved women knew of the whispers too. They heard them carried back by the overseer, by merchants, by field hands who had traveled into town. To them, the whispers were a double-edged thing. On one hand, they exposed the master's cruelty, cracking the mask of southern gentility. On the other, they changed nothing. The master's power was unshaken, their bondage unbroken. Gossip might stain his reputation, but it did not loosen their chains. Still, the whispers carried a dangerous possibility. Rumors have a way of feeding unrest, of planting seeds that grow in silence. Among the enslaved, some began to wonder, If the world beyond the plantation knew, if they truly understood the depth of his corruption, might they turn against him? Could scandal ever topple a man so fortified by wealth and cruelty? The questions lingered, fragile but persistent. For the wife, however, the whispers did not bring hope. They brought humiliation that no wealth could conceal. She began to withdraw from society, refusing invitations, locking herself within the plantation walls. What had once been a gilded cage now felt like a coffin. The laughter of her husband's children outside her window mocked her. The murmurs of townsfolk echoed in her skull. She could not escape the knowledge that her shame was now public property, and in that shame, something darker began to stir. Resentment hardened into rage, not only at her husband, not only at the enslaved women, but at the entire world that mocked her suffering. She imagined silencing them all, imagined fire consuming the fields, imagined blood staining the parlor floor. These thoughts, once fleeting, began to take root, curling deep into her mind like vines choking a tree. The master remained blind to her torment. He believed himself untouchable, armored by wealth, protected by the very system that made cruelty profitable. But the wife's silence was no longer submission, it was calculation. And though the whispers in Georgia mocked her weakness, they had awakened something the master did not expect. The quiet resolve of a woman with nothing left to lose. The whispers spread, louder, sharper, impossible to contain. And within the walls of the plantation, beneath the suffocating weight of humiliation, the air began to thrum with the promise of something inevitable. The breaking point does not arrive in a single moment of thunder. It creeps slowly like rot in a beam of wood, unseen until the structure collapses. For years, the wife endured humiliation in silence. She bore the mockery of townsfolk, the whispers in the church pews, the laughter of children that did not belong to her. She kept her rage buried, smothered beneath duty and prayer. But silence corrodes, and patience has limits. By the time autumn came, her silence was no longer restraint. It was a mask stretched thin across the fissures of her soul. Every morning she awoke to the sound of children playing outside her window. The master's children, not hers. Their voices filled the air with a cruel reminder of what she lacked, of what her body had denied her. She would watch them from the upstairs balcony, their features a distorted echo of the man she had once vowed to honor. Sometimes she clenched the rail until her knuckles whitened, imagining pushing one of them into the dirt, silencing their laughter forever. At night, she lay awake beside her husband, his breathing heavy with drunken sleep. She stared at him in the dim glow of the hearth, studying the face that had destroyed hers. The whispers of the town returned to her in those hours, useless, barren, cuckolded by slaves. Each word burned hotter until hatred coiled so tightly in her chest that she thought her ribs might shatter. Her husband noticed her silence, but mistook it for submission. He wore his victories openly, parading his children across the plantation grounds as if daring the world to condemn him. He boasted of his bloodline multiplying, of his legacy spreading across fields of cotton. When he laughed, she felt something in her splinter. The church offered no refuge. Once she had knelt and begged for deliverance, prayed that God might strike her husband down or grant her a child of her own. But no thunder came, no miracle bloomed in her womb. The pews had become gallows, and every hymn felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Faith, once her anchor, dissolved into dust. In its absence, something else took root, the quiet certainty that no salvation would come. If justice was to exist, she would have to create it herself. Her breaking point revealed itself in small acts at first. A glass shattered in her hand when she served her husband brandy. She crushed a porcelain figurine in her fist, cutting her palm but feeling nothing. She walked through the nursery and overturned a cradle, staring at it as though it were a coffin. Servants whispered of her sudden violence, of the madness that flickered in her eyes, but no one dared to confront her. The enslaved women sensed it too. They saw the way her gaze lingered on them, part envy, part fury, part something more dangerous. To them, she was not a victim but another master, complicit in cruelty, envious of their bodies only because they bore fruit. Yet even they began to feel uneasy. For madness has no loyalty, and in her silence, the wife was becoming something unpredictable. One night, as the master drank himself into a stupor, she sat alone in the parlor. The house was silent save for the crackle of fire. Before her lay a Bible, but instead of opening it, she tore the pages from the binding, feeding them one by one into the flames. Scripture burned, curling into ash, until nothing remained but the smoke of promises unkept. Watching the holy words dissolve, she felt strangely free, as though she had severed the last tether to a God who had abandoned her. It was then that her thoughts turned from rage to plan. She began to measure her husband's steps, how often he lingered in the fields, how long he drank before collapsing, which nights he stumbled to the cabins. She studied the household like a general plotting a siege. The children, too, became part of her calculations. How they scattered when frightened, how their games left them vulnerable, how easily innocence could be silenced. Her plan was not yet formed, but its bones were there, rising like a skeleton in her mind. The master would not live forever. His empire of cruelty would crumble one way or another, and when it did, she would not remain the humiliated wife. She would be its architect. Yet, beneath her fury, a strange tenderness haunted her. She sometimes thought of the children, not hers but his. They were innocent of his sins, yet every smile reminded her of her own emptiness. There were nights when she wept, clutching her belly, imagining a child that never was, a child she might have loved, but grief only sharpened the blade of her hatred. For every unborn child she mourned, there were living reminders of her failure running through the halls. The breaking point was not an explosion, it was a slow, steady unmaking. Her love turned to contempt, her faith to ash, her silence to conspiracy. By winter's edge, the wife who once endured humiliation had vanished. What remained was a shadow draped in silk, a woman whose heart had hollowed itself into a vessel for vengeance. And though the master laughed, though the children played, though the plantation thrummed with the illusion of prosperity, something unseen had shifted. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though it sensed the violence gestating within its walls. Servants whispered of cold drafts where none should exist, of doors slamming shut without wind, of shadows that moved against the light. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls absorbed the wife's rage and exhaled it in secret. The breaking point had come. Nothing had yet burned, no blood had yet spilled, but the promise of it lingered, sharp as the scent of iron before a storm. The wife no longer prayed for deliverance. She prayed only for courage to do what she now knew must be done. The end did not come quietly. It began with a flicker, the smallest of flames, yet within hours it would consume everything the master had built. The wife, silent for so long, finally let her vengeance speak, and its language was fire. That night, the plantation was restless. The cicadas droned in the fields, the air thick with late summer heat. The master had retreated to his study, a half-empty decanter of brandy at his side, his laughter still echoing from earlier boasts at supper. His children slept scattered across the house, some in cradles, others curled in beds upstairs. The enslaved women huddled in their quarters, weary from a day of back-breaking labor. To any eye, it was an ordinary night on a Georgia estate. But in the shadows of the hallway, the wife moved like a phantom. She carried no candle, no light, only a small oil lamp concealed beneath her shawl. Her steps were soundless, her breathing steady, her eyes dark with a clarity she had not known in years. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, each flame, each scream, each collapse of timber and bone. She began in the cotton fields. The dry stalks rustled under her hand as she walked between the rows, the lamp trembling only slightly in her grasp. She bent low, pouring oil into the soil, letting it soak into the roots of the master's wealth. Then with a hand that did not tremble, she lowered the flame. The fire caught quickly, first a whisper, then a roar. Flames climbed the stalks, devouring them, racing outward with greedy hunger. Within moments, the cotton fields, once the pride of the master, once the currency of his cruelty, blazed like an inferno. The enslaved quarters stirred in panic. Men and women bolted upright, their eyes widening at the sight of orange glow rising over the fields. Some ran to fetch water, others to shield their children. But the wife did not flinch. She stood at the edge of the flames, her face bathed in their light, her silhouette tall and unyielding. To her, the fire was not destruction, it was justice, long overdue. The master was slower to rise. He stumbled from his study, brandy still clinging to his breath, his voice booming with confusion and rage. "What in God's name?" he bellowed, but his words were drowned by the crackle of flames and the shouts of the enslaved. He staggered to the porch, and there he saw her. His wife, standing at the heart of it all, her eyes fixed on him through the inferno. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. "Have you lost your senses, woman?" he roared, but the authority in his voice was gone. "Do you know what you've done?" She did not answer. She simply turned, oil lamp still in hand, and walked toward the barn. The barn went next. Dry hay and timber burst alive under her touch, flames curling upward to the rafters. Horses shrieked, thrashing in their stalls, the smell of burning flesh piercing the night. The master, now fully aware of the disaster, charged toward her, but the heat drove him back. His empire was unraveling faster than his feet could carry him. And still, she was not finished. Inside the house, the children stirred. The master shouted for them, his voice ragged with desperation. He stumbled into the nursery, lifting one child into his arms while calling for the others. His hands shook, his breath broke. He was a man who had spent his life in control, now reduced to a frantic animal. The wife appeared in the doorway. Her silk dress shimmered with ash and smoke, her face pale but steady. In her hand, the oil lamp burned low, its flame the last instrument of her vengeance. "Don't!" the master choked, clutching the child. "For God's sake, don't!" Her voice was calm, eerily calm. "There is no God here." And with that, she hurled the lamp into the curtains. The room erupted, screams tore through the house, mingling with the roar of collapsing beams and the desperate cries of children. The enslaved women outside wailed, some torn between terror and a grim, forbidden sense of retribution. For them, this was no salvation, it was chaos. Indiscriminate and merciless, but it was also the downfall of the man who had tormented them. The master fought through smoke and fire, clutching his son, dragging another child by the arm. He shouted for his wife, for his legacy, for the life that was slipping from his grasp. But she did not run. She walked calmly into the flames, her figure swallowed in orange glow, as though the fire had claimed her as its own. The house collapsed before dawn. Its timbers fell with a groan that echoed across the fields, a sound that would be remembered by every soul who witnessed it. When the sun rose, nothing remained but charred ruins, smoldering cotton, and ash drifting across the Georgia soil. The master was found in the wreckage, clutching the lifeless bodies of two of his children. His face, once so proud, was frozen in horror, his empire reduced to cinders. As for the wife, no body was ever recovered. Some whispered she perished in the flames. Others claimed she fled into the night, her madness carrying her into the woods where no one dared follow. Still others believed she lingered in the ruins, a spirit bound to the land. Her vengeance unfinished. The enslaved who survived told the story in hushed voices, passing it down in secret, a warning and a testament. They spoke of the night when the plantation burned, when fire swallowed the master's pride, when justice, however cruel, walked in the form of a broken woman. And though the ashes cooled, the memory did not. For in Georgia's soil, beneath the weight of cotton and blood, there lingered the ghost of that fire, a reminder of sins too great to bury. The fire in the fields was not merely an end. It was a legacy of shadows, a curse that would outlive them all.